beautiful Salt Lake City, or so I hear. I think I've driven through Salt Lake City. I've never really spent much time there. Neither here nor there. You don't care about my driving habits. Utah at UC or USC at Utah. This game is obviously one of the biggest ones of the Pac-12 slate. Utah is a 3.5-point home favorite. The over-under is set for 65. And let me just say this even before we get into the breakdown of the game. Can we credit Lincoln Riley? I mean, listen, and I said this a few weeks ago with Brian Kelly and Marcus Freeman, and Marcus Freeman has done a nice job bouncing back. But it says something about a coach. When a coach can go somewhere, take a 4-8 roster, and completely flip it around, and they're 6-0 right now. It's worth noting, by the way, the place that he left. And Oklahoma fans are going to make every excuse in the book. It's Lincoln Riley's fault. It's the transfer portal. It's this, it's that. And I understand they didn't have their starting quarterback last week, Dylan Gabriel, for Oklahoma. Oklahoma's a complete mess right now. And so I only bring it up to say credit Lincoln Riley, man. I thought this team would be good. I do think that they are very much ahead of schedule, though, at 6-0. I thought they'd get tripped up somewhere. I thought they'd probably lose this game to Utah, lose to UCLA, finish about 8-4, 9-3, and we'd call it a day. Well, they win this game. All of a sudden, we could be talking about UCLA, USC to go to the college football playoff because USC does not have Oregon or Washington on the schedule. In terms of USC itself, I think it's interesting. Let's talk a little bit about them, because what's interesting about them is there's two things that really stand out to me. One, I do think that when we think about Lincoln Riley, we think about the passing offense. We think about all the great quarterbacks that he's had. Baker Mayfield, Kyler Murray, win Heisman trophies. Jalen Hurts, obviously, of course, was a Heisman runner-up. Caleb Williams is probably potentially going to be the number one pick in the draft in 2024. But I don't think people realize USC is playing really good complementary football right now. They're actually running the ball about 34 times a game, passing the ball about 32 times per game. And so a lot of these great offenses, we think of the Steve Sarkisian offense, the Lane Kiffin offense, the Lincoln Riley offense, that they're all based on throwing the ball all over the field. No, they're actually based on the run. And to USC's credit, they have done a great job of that so far. And I think I think you could argue, I'm not saying that I would, but I think you could argue that Travis Dye, the transfer from Oregon, has been their MVP so far. I'm not saying that I necessarily totally 1,000% believe it, but 149 yards rushing last week against Wazoo, 133 against Oregon State, and they needed every one in that narrow win, 102 against Fresno, 105 against Stanford. So for the last 5 games, he's hit the 100-yard mark. I think that's important here. USC is winning because of the complementary football they're playing. They're also winning because of what I just told you a minute ago with Alabama. They have an insane turnover margin. How about this? 14 turnovers forced, 1 turnover the entire season. And they also have a top 15 red zone defense. And so I've talked about this before. But like this idea that USC, if they don't score 60 points, they're not going to win. That's just not true. They're forcing turnovers. They're good in the red zone. They run the ball. They do all the things that you need to win. Now, what would concern me about this game, Utah's a 3.5-point favorite in the Betfred Sportsbook, and I think it's for an obvious reason. 1, home game for Utah. 2, and I think this is important, most of what USC does well, Utah does well as well, and they're just a more established team and program and brand and whatever. And when I say brand, I mean like the last 5 years. I'm not talking about over the history of college football, just so that's clarified. But Utah, listen, they lose at UCLA last week, and I'll say this, man, like it was very weird to me to see the reaction to Utah losing to UCLA. I saw all this, this proves Utah was overrated, and how could anybody pick them to make the playoff? I think UCLA is just really good. And if you look at Utah over the course of the season, I know they lost week 1 to Florida. Keep in mind, that's week 1. Anthony Richardson, there's no tape, whatever. Fast forward to the rest of the season, they were really good up until that UCLA game when UCLA just gashed them for over 200 yards on the ground. I do wonder if USC has the guys up front to contend with Utah on the defensive line and in the front 7. Utah has a pretty good run defense. Statistically, it doesn't look great thanks to UCLA putting up 200 yards on the ground last week. But this is a team that I think is really good, even if they are sitting at 4-2 here in the middle of the season. The other thing, and I think it's important when it comes to Utah, they do a really good job of taking care of the football. USC has by far the best turnover margin in college football. Utah's in the top 15 nationally. Cam Rising, to his credit in his career, 33 touchdowns, 8 interceptions. This year, 13 touchdowns, 3 interceptions, and he's done a very good job of taking care of the football as well. And so if I'm a USC fan, I think those are two variables that come into play. What I have done well to get us to this point, I've run the ball and I've taken care of the football. Those are two things that Utah does very well in their own right, and it would concern me if I was a USC fan. So the Betfred line here is 3.5. I do like Utah. I also think the other thing to consider, Utah's played two really tough road games. This is their first trip back. I think their first real big game in Salt Lake City. I do think this part is important as well, is that from the USC perspective, they're 6-0. Give them credit. I'm not trying to take away what they've done. But 17-14 win against Oregon State, where they easily could have lost that game. And they did beat Stanford 41-28 on the road in week 2. But even in that game, Stanford had 4 turnovers. And I know part of this is credit to the USC defense, but Stanford had 4 turnovers. And on top of having 4 turnovers, this is the important part. 2 of them were deep inside USC territory, or deep inside their own territory, I should say, which set up basically 10 gimme points. So if Stanford just took care of the ball, punted, all of a sudden we're looking at a 31-28 game instead of a 41-28 game. I do think Utah wins. I do think Utah covers. The Betfred Sportsbook bet is 3.5, and that is my pick.